Recording in progress.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, today we're actually going to be speaking about this very important topic, which is the basis of honor in Islam. And it's really wanting to compare two hadith that relate to this matter because it's extremely important. How do we understand honor? And especially during our times where it's all about individual protection, it's all about you, it's all about you being the center of everything. And that many times we can put in our own interpretation, and especially in the midst of all this motivational speaking, many times we would focus on the motivational speakers rather than actually see what did the Prophet ﷺ actually say in regards to this honor, this topic. And this is extremely important. Let's look at the first hadith. We're going to look at these two different hadith, although they kind of overlap in some ways, but let's look at them. So this first hadith was narrated by, you could see, narrated by Ahmad and Tirmidhi. And the Prophet ﷺ says in this hadith, ثلاثة أقسم عليهن. In other words, the Prophet ﷺ is basically saying that there are three that the Prophet ﷺ is making an oath the truth of this matter. Number one, ما نقص مال عبد من صدقة. Number one is that no donation is reduced, or in other words, no donation reduces the wealth that a person had donated from. Number two, ولو ظلم عبد مظلمة فصبر عليها إلا زاده الله عزا. No servant is oppressed, but then they would practice patience, but the Lord Almighty increases in their honor. ولا فتح عبد باب مسألة إلا فتح الله عليه باب فقر. And any servant that opens the door to seeking help or basically asking and questing for different support, but the Lord Almighty would open a door of poverty or a door of need from another end. Let's look at the other hadith. I know that it's still not yet explained. That's exactly what the class in today's lecture is about. It's really trying to understand what this hadith is saying. The first hadith, that previous hadith, was narrated by Abu Kabsha, okay? Or at least the narrator is Abu Kabsha. The second hadith, ما نقصت صدقة من مال, kind of means the same thing. No sadaqah, no donation would reduce or at least be deducted from any wealth. In other words, what you are seeing is not necessarily the reality of what the matter is. You're donating, but yes, you had $2,000, you donated, let's assume $500. It doesn't mean that you're 1,500. It actually means you're more. How is that even how's that even making at all any sense? We're going to get there. وما زاد الله عبدا بعفو إلا عزا. Any servant that would give in, it would really increase only in their honor. وَمَا تَوَاضَعَ أَحَدٌ لِلَّهِ إِلَّا رَفَعَهُ. And anybody that would be humble for the sake of Allah Almighty, the Lord Almighty would elevate them. So there are a number of different issues. I know the words are kind of ambiguous right now, but let's just look into a number of different things in the hadith. The first hadith is narrated by Abu Kabsh al-Anmari. Abu Kabsha is basically the ex-servant of the Prophet ﷺ, or ex-slave for the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, Abu Kabsha, when I say he was the ex-slave of the Prophet ﷺ, that simply means he was living in close proximity with the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, he was living in the household of the Prophet ﷺ. He was the one that narrated the famous hadith, خيركم خيركم لأهله. The best of you is the best of you to his own family. Although Abu Kabsha's name, is not necessarily known, whether it's Sulaim, Amr, Mihran, Kaysan, etc. But at the time, they didn't used to necessarily care about the first name. It becomes a nickname that people know them for, and that's how they become familiar to people. Now, The other hadith is narrated by Abu Huraira, but they pretty much overlap in the meaning. They pretty much overlap in the whole idea of a number of different sides. The different sides in where it's talking about sadaqah, it's talking about a person that is containing themselves despite their oppression and giving in, and it's also talking about being humble. Let's look at the first segment of it. ما نقص مال من صدقة. We know that by donating $2,000, you basically have only $2,000. You donated $500. That's the value is supposed to be that you had deducted 500, that you only have 1,500 left. But the Prophet ﷺ is actually telling you, you've actually have gotten your calculation wrong. That the real value actually increased, but you only looked and thought that the real value is in the number that was there. So the Prophet ﷺ is actually telling you that the true value is not necessarily in the numbers, but the true value is what actually is more valuable than the numbers that you actually had seen. So, for example, when you look at the trade off, you decide that you want to buy a cup, probably $5. You decided to give up on the $5 because to you, that cup was worth the $5 that you worked for. And that's the same thing. In where the increase in the value is a lot more than what you had actually thought the real value of that money. The real increase is really in your akhlaq, the real increase in the value of not money, but in the value of the principle that you had actually increased on the inside. So, what is the increase in? The increase is really in the principle. The increase is in the trade off in where you gave up on your dunya in order to gain from the akhirah. You gave up on your dunya in order to get the rank in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because at the end of the day, what you see in terms of money, everything actually belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You are just given that rizq, you're just given that money, and it is just temporarily with you. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ was taking you to redefining and taking your focus from recognizing that the world around you, you need to say it from a different angle. Therefore, you need to redefine the true value of what really matters to you. Is it the money that you have in your hands? Or is it the principle that you would like to gain? Or is it the akhlaq instead of the money? You're actually gaining the akhlaq, the principle of giving in, the principle of sharing, the principle of caring, the principle that you really want the akhirah more than the dunya. And when you look at that, yes, it is definitely a blessing in where the Prophet ﷺ said, ما نقص مال من صدقة. But it's also a force that you don't see and you don't recognize that actually has its power. And that's why you see that it's an investment here, but you would think of it that, well, where did it go? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, wait a minute. The money that you are here investing in, whether you're talking about a positive force or a negative force, at the end of the day, it's actually going to come back to you ولو بعد حين, even if that might have been maybe even generations to come. We said in our class yesterday how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had told us about the man in Surah Al-Kahf, that the reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala maintained his grandson or his son's rizq was really كان أبوهما صالحا. It was an investment that his father or his great grandfather had invested in from his piety. What was being paid? What was being harvested. When was it being harvested? It could be actually generations to come. Well, if the khair was going to be harvested in probably even years to come, shar and evil could also rub on the person without you recognizing. And that's why we always say, be careful on what you say or what you do. The Prophet ﷺ said that one may say a word, لا يلقي لها بالا, not even giving it any attention whatsoever, not regarding it of even a word that that person is going to be held accountable for. تهوي به 70 خريفا في قعر جهنم. Yet the Lord Almighty will hold them accountable for it, and it would take them for 70 years at the bottom of hellfire without them even recognizing that it was really a word that they had said and thought of it as such a trivial word, not a big deal. Well, that's the same thing. And where a person can say a kind word and it would elevate them in the eyes and probably even in the position of Jannah without them recognizing that that was a good word, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was going to reward them for it. Even though they didn't think that it was going to be something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was going to let it a force that will change their life. And that's the same thing. When you're talking about sadaqah, it's all about, through this hadith, it's all about recognizing that the forces that you invest in, the khair that you invest in, it goes far beyond your understanding of physics right now. It goes far beyond in its influence than what you would think as right now, a year or 2 years or 3. It goes far beyond. That's why he said, مَا نَقَصَ مَالٌ مِّن صَدَقَةٍ. You give in and the Lord Almighty will preserve it for you. It's a force, it's a power that goes far beyond your expectations, far beyond the value of what you had thought was the real value. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ used to make dua, Allahumma a'ti munfiqan khalafa. Ya Allah, give those that had spent for the sake of Allah Almighty a compensation farther than what they had expected. Al-Izz ibn Abd Salam, a Shafi'i scholar, he said that nothing goes away. In other words, nothing is lost from sadaqah. When you give in, another value comes in. Something else farther and even more valuable and more worthy than the money that you had invested. It's not necessarily just in sadaqah, but the hadith was talking about sadaqah, but the whole issue is really to redefine and let our vision re-see the world from a different angle. That when you give in, it's about time that you recognize that the amount that you give in, it comes back to you at a different force. It comes back to you at a different value. It comes back to you by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He'll compensate you for it without you recognizing. Let's see the other type of compensation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you. When you look at this hadith, when you look at ما نقص مال من صدقة, you would really, in this world, we would think of money bringing in money. Money, that's how you invest. Money brings in money, and that's what makes any type of trade. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, no, you've got your calculations wrong. That's why he goes into the second one. وَلَا ظُلِمَ عَبْدٌ مَظْلَمَةً فَصَبَرَ عَلَيْهَا إِلَّا زَادَهُ اللَّهُ عِزًّا. Any oppression that any servant is patient over, the Lord Almighty would actually increase their honor. We would usually think that if you are facing a trauma, you're facing some form of oppression, that's really nothing but getting you weaker and weaker. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually telling you, and the Prophet ﷺ in this hadith is telling you, actually your calculations are quite not accurate. because you don't recognize the real forces that happen. In where, let's look at this one. ظلم عبد مظلمة. The person, this is a servant, this is a human being that's facing this trauma, that's facing this oppression. In the eyes of the people, this person is facing nothing but abuse. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, actually, His power extends farther beyond than what you would do in terms of calculating the situation and the circumstance. You would calculate that the circumstance is this person is weak. There was another person that had enough power, authority over this person. This person is losing power, losing honor. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, you've got your calculations wrong. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, the situation is وَمَنْ قُتِلَ مَظْلُومًا فَقَدْ جَعَلْنَا لِوَلِيِّهِ سُلْطَانًا فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ. Anybody in Surah Al-Isra, anyone that is killed in an oppressive manner, the Lord Almighty would give those that are in guardianship over this person a sultan, a power. فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ. So they should not abuse this power. In other words, what you had seen is that this person, قُتِلَ مَظْلُومًا, this person was killed in an oppressive situation. You only saw one angle of it, that this person was right now abused, oppressed. This person is dead. That's all you see. You don't know that the force of the Lord Almighty being the one to bring about justice is never going to let those circumstances rule on this world and in this earth. That the Lord Almighty's force of justice, just as His force of rizq, is what determines how all the sunan and how all the paradigms are actually constructed in this world. So just as in the first segment of hadith, you only saw that the rizq, that this money is bringing in, is losing value by giving in donation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, no, the real rizq is not necessarily based on the calculations that you do. Same thing right here. The social justice, you thought that this person was in a place of having social injustice, therefore they got weaker. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet are telling you, what you don't recognize is that they're actually gaining something else. And what that something else is actually honor, is actually power. When we speak of honor, we speak of power. When we speak of power, we speak of authority. This person may not recognize what power they're actually up to, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet is telling you that you have to recognize that you should not live for the rest of your life thinking that the trauma is your destiny and that whatever abuse that you went through is your destiny. But the Lord Almighty, with His justice, He's the one. If you are to be patient, what does it mean to be patient? To be patient means not to constantly complain. To be patient means to hold on to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To be patient means not because you're abused to constantly use abusive language and try to probably drink or use alcohol or use probably drugs to make you forget, because that's the opposite of sabr. Sabr means to contain your own feelings, your own emotions, and to make sure that you live based on principle. And you let Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be the one to defend you. But if you are going through abuse and you decided to go drinking or to probably take the matters in your own hands and probably kill the person or probably hit the person or whatever it is, then in that situation, you had not been patient, but you decided to take the matters in your own hands. In that situation, well, you decided to take the matters in your own hands. That wasn't sabr. You decided to do your own retaliation. Al-izz is when, and honor is when you let Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala take the matters. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, you need to see how the force of the Lord Almighty, as al-adil, as the most just, is actually working its ways. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us right there in that hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually said that ليس الشديد بالسرعة إنما الشديد الذي يملك نفسه عند الغضب. This hadith is authentic and highly authentic because it is actually muttafaqun alayh. Muttafaqun alayh simply means it was narrated by Bukhari and Muslim. What does he say? Well, the Prophet ﷺ says that the true strong person, the real strong person, is not the person that overcomes others by their power, by their anger, by their force, but in fact is the person that contains themselves when they're in extreme anger. In other words, the Prophet ﷺ is telling us right there that the true strength is weighed not by overcoming others, but by self-discipline, self-value, and not the definition of power that or authority or bullying that people might actually think is the power. That's why the Prophet ﷺ was told by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانْفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ فَاعْفُ عَنْهُمْ وَاسْتَغْفِرْ لَهُمْ وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet ﷺ, if you were, the word is fadhan, if you were harsh, if your heart was hardened, and people would have actually repelled away from you. So in order to gain this acceptance, to gain the love, fa'fu anhum, forgive them. Wastaghfir lahum, seek forgiveness for them. Shawirhum fil amr, be humble and ask them for different opinions from them, because they will feel that you are considering their opinions and that you're not putting yourself necessarily on top of all the different matters. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was also teaching the Prophet ﷺ, خُذِ الْعَفْوَ وَأْمُرْ بِالْعُرْفِ وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْجَاهِلِينَ. Yes, that was the first ayah right here, was telling the Prophet ﷺ about a behavior that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had disciplined in, a morality that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala disciplined him in. But in the second ayah, look at this one. خُذِ الْعَفْوَ. Whenever someone wants to give you a kind gesture, just accept it. Accept these nice gestures. وَأْمُرْ بِالْعُرْفِ. In order for what is good. You go back to the Quran in order to identify where the boundaries are. وَأْمُرْ بِالْعُرْفِ. Order for what is good. And when other people trespass their boundaries, أعرض عن الجاهلين. Learn how to keep distance from those that just don't know how to maintain their boundaries. أعرض عن الجاهلين. Those that live based on their own selves, individualism, that live based on their own centricity. Well, those people are jahiliyyah. They're living based on jahiliyyah. So stay away from those. Just keep away, because these people don't know how to contain themselves. Let's look at the other hadith, in where the hadith, the top one is the hadith that is rated by Abu Kabsha, and this one is basically Abu Hurairah. The second one, we're working on two hadith. Remember, وَمَا زَدَ اللَّهُ عَبْدًا بِعَفْوٍ إِلَّا عِزًّا. Any servant that would give in other words, al-afu, give in, forgive people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would only increase in their izzah, would only increase in their honor. And this is the most thing that we're actually in need for right now. It's really honor. We don't recognize that honor, and that's why we're actually getting, whether it's the enemies or our own selves, or even those that are not practicing Islam right, that are not putting Islam in the right places. They're humiliating those that are trying to practice Islam right. Let's just look at this one. Being strong and defending truth is obligatory. Why am I actually saying that? Because many times we would assume that in order to be strong or be a good believer, that we're somehow supposed to be, always giving in and always giving up and letting other people abuse us. This is actually not the truth. You're supposed to be strong in defending truth, and that's obligatory. In fact, let's look at this one. If you cannot say the truth, do not say falsehood. Let's look at what Umar ibn al-Khattab had said. He said, هل تعرف ما يهدم الإسلام? Do you know what destructs Islam? Islam is, of course, a religion that is formidable, okay? And definitely nothing will destruct Islam. But he said, that he responded, that is Ziyad, he said, no, I don't know. He said, يهدمه زلة عالم وجدال المنافق بالكتاب وحكم الأئمة المضلين. This is on the spot. He said, what really destructs it is a mistake that a scholar might do, and the argument that a hypocrite will put in. In other words, a hypocrite will start arguing about the Quran and about the Sunnah, and then you'll have the rule and the power and who will overcome. It's basically الأئمة المضلين. أئمة, that those that might have some knowledge, but they would manipulate and delude the masses. They would give the wrong interpretation, probably in order to gain popularity, in order to gain some form of a CV, maybe to gain a position, etc. And what are they? Yeah, they've probably got some ilm. Some ilm. They're not Rabbaniyin. What is a Rabbani? A Rabbani is a person that will not sell Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's deen, not for money, not for popularity, and not for a position, and not for dunya. They will do whatever it takes to announce the truth, even if that meant their life, their money, their position, no matter what it means. They're willing to stand up and defend Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's word. That is Rabbani. Here, when you see حكم الأئمة المضلين, when Umar ibn al-Khattab was talking about that there would be these leaders that will be deluding others, there will be these different scholars that might actually make a mistake, and then ذلة العالم is ذلة العالم. The mistake that a scholar might do, it doesn't just end there. It actually makes the masses go wrong, because they all depended on him for guidance, and then he misguided all of them. جدال المنافق بالكتاب. This is right now probably the most prevalent. In will you have the hypocrite all of the sudden be assigned to be the sheikh, the sheikha, or whatever it is, when in reality they're nothing but hypocrites. They don't even have the specialty or even the qualification to speak on Quran and Sunnah, and they become those that will argue and argue. And social media right now is filled with these types of people, in where they'll actually be the ones to become the motivational speakers, and all of a sudden become the ones to guide, quote unquote, guide the masses into a new interpretation of the religion. So what actually becomes to destruct the situation and misguide the masses? It's basically these three. Maybe you could just remember them. يهدمه زلة عالم جدال المنافق بالكتاب حكم الأئمة المضلين. That's the situation we're living in right now. So therefore, when we actually speak about being strong and defending truth, this is extremely important. It doesn't mean that you just, well, I don't want to be strong, and then let or make others seem like I was trying to be not humble enough. No, when you are speaking and defending Islam, be strong. It doesn't mean in that situation, if you're actually thinking that you're being humble, you're actually being weak. Being humble is when you're talking about yourself. But when you're in a position defending Islam, you're right now, yes, supposed to be taking the izzah, the honor, because right now you're in a position to being the spokesperson to defend Islam. So you better be strong. To be weak at that point, or to think that it's about time to be humble, you're humble in the wrong place. And that's why you would appear at that moment like you're weak, like you're putting Islam in a weak position. So what does it mean to defend truth, and who's responsible? Let's look at Ibn al-Qayyim. Now note, Ibn al-Qayyim is one of the most important scholars. His book I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in, which is what I quoted from here. Let's look at what he says right here. Ibn al-Qayyim, he said, حكم الله ورسوله يظهر على أربعة ألسن. He said, the ruling of the Lord Almighty and His Messenger actually appears on 4 tongues. And of course, when he says 4 tongues, he's actually talking about a metaphor here. Let's see what he says. The first one, he said, the tongue of a narrator, that is a narrator of hadith. 2, the tongue of a mufti, the tongue of a person that's teaching Islam. The tongue of a leader, or a political leader, or a person in a position of ruling somehow. Could be a person leading in a political position, or probably even in a school, or probably in the family. وَلِسَانُ الشَّاهِدِ, and the tongue of a witness. And he said the 4, they have a duty in order to speak the truth that is based on ilm, that's based on knowledge. And the mistake that any of them would do, whether in lying or concealing truth. So whenever one would conceal the truth or even lie about it, that is when it would be exactly like they had went against the Lord Almighty in His legislature and even in His religion. And the Lord Almighty had actually ruled in all of His different rules throughout history, that the Lord Almighty would take away the blessings of their knowledge, the blessing, or even their religion, or even their dunya, in other words, the provisions that they have, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will actually take it away from them. And whoever holds on to truth and clarification to bring about the clarification of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said about that is based on ilm, then the Lord Almighty would increase the barakah, the blessings in their knowledge, in their time, in their deen, and even in their dunya. Now, here's one thing. If any were to actually be constrained, and in other words, keep the ilm and not speak the truth or even bring about the clarity, then at the end, the Lord Almighty here, in that situation, what we need to do is get this person out of the power that they are in. And at the end, the Lord Almighty would also hold them accountable. What I want to write their quote, and the most important part, is that whenever you come across any situation, whether it's a family issue or whether it's any issue that surrounds you, that you always have to go back to Islam. Know what Islam rules in this matter, because if you don't know what Islam rules, you're basing yourself as the basis and you've got your own biases. You will be committing oppression without you recognizing, and every Muslim is responsible to learn Islam and deliver what Islam says, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, الَّذِينَ يُبَلِّغُونَ رِسَالَاتِ اللَّهِ وَيَخْشَوْنَهُ وَلَا يَخْشَوْنَ أَحَدًا إِلَّا اللَّهِ وَكَفَى بِاللَّهِ حَسِيبًا. Your main duty is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here is telling you, those that would deliver the messages and the messages of the Lord Almighty, and they would fear the Lord Almighty, and they would fear no one but Allah Almighty, and the Lord Almighty would hold them accountable. In other words, whenever you see any matter, your duty is to learn what Islam says and to look for it. Now here's one thing, keep note. The reason why I'm speaking of this is because we're seeing a lot of people acting in the wrong and the confusion, the wrong stances and the confusion in understanding when to be humble, especially those that are in religion. Many times they're confusing the different matters. So she's being humble at the wrong time, which is making her seem and be weak. And then she's being strong at the wrong time, because then she's actually acting in oppression. She doesn't recognize it. So that's why when we speak about confidence in deen, should not be confused with arrogance, because many will confuse confidence and high self-esteem as considering it that that's arrogance. Many may accuse you of having arrogance in deen, when to them what they cannot tolerate is the independence of spirit in someone's deen, or the high presence that someone has. Therefore, beware that many will pass on these accusations as a projection of their own envy, and instead of resolving their matters, they will attack and search for flaws in you. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, فَاصْبِرْ إِنَّ وَعْدَ اللَّهِ حَقًّا. Be patient, for the promise of the Lord Almighty is truth. وَلَا يَسْتَخِفَّنَّكَ الَّذِينَ لَا يُوقِنُونَ. And don't let those that don't have affirmation or don't have faith in the word of the Lord Almighty regard you as lacking honor. You have to give honor to the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because if you're confusing the matters, then you're actually doing you're doing not a service to the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by actually being weak when you're supposed to be strong. In order to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and when He wants you to be humble, and when He wants you to be strong, you gotta put the matters in their place, because confusing the matters and putting them in the wrong places is in itself injustice, is in itself the kind of confusion and the manipulation that you could be falling in. Being humble in your self-esteem is obligatory. There's no doubt about that. Where's the fine line? When you're defending truth and Islam, that's when you have to be strong. When you're speaking about yourself and relating with others, in other words, I'm here, trying to defend myself, I've got a point, etc. That's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, وَخْفَضْ جَنَاحَكَ لِمَنِ اتَّبَعَكَ مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. That's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you. The Prophet ﷺ, he was telling him, you gotta lower that wing of humility for those that would follow you from the believers. And of course, this is a metaphor. That's in order to say, bring them in under your wing. Be humble, be warm, have a warm conversation, live on the same status, talk to them. Even the Prophet ﷺ would talk to them, would ask, for example, Jabir ibn Abdullah, did you get married? And who is the woman that you got married to? Is she a virgin? Why wouldn't you marry somebody that doesn't have an experience before? All of these questions, even though to us during our times, this is a personal question. But this is in order for us to learn that having a personal conversation is not always necessarily intruding, but sometimes it's showing that you care. Sometimes it's showing and giving an advice to somebody. Sometimes, and this is one reason why we're actually right now struggling a lot, because our social cues, instead of going better, we're actually going behind in our social cues, because many times we had lost these social interactions and then lost learning from other people's experiences. And what we end up with is making and committing the same mistake that others have committed. And then we end up doing the same exact, going through the same exact situation that other people are going through. That's why when you talk about being humble, you're actually talking about you yourself getting more and more education and learning more from those that had went through probably a lot of different things, in where you're recognizing that other people's experiences are worthy of value. Other people's self-esteem are worthy of value. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَمْشِ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَحًا إِنَّكَ لَن تَخْرِقَ الْأَرْضَ وَلَن تَبْلُغَ الْجِبَالَ طُولًا. And don't walk with the gait of pride, for you have not been the one to rip the earth or even reach the height of mountains. At the end of the day, who really deserves the real pride? It's really Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because He's the one that actually is the one to created everything. He's the force behind every single thing that you see in the world around you, not you. Even if, that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually tells us in terms of giving a sadaqah, وَلَا تُبْطِلُوا صَدَقَاتِكُمْ بِالْمَنِّ وَالْأَذَى. Is sadaqah. Don't void the sadaqahs that you give, بالمن والأذى, bilman, by bragging about it or even giving harm. In other words, you invested, you helped, you were, in your own household. Don't tell your husband, I cleaned the house for you, I did this to your kids, and I do this to you, and you're still doing this. Why are you bragging about it? What about the other? You're bringing in harm. You had done it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You invested. Would you want him to come and brag, I worked these many hours for you in order to bring you food and etc.? Of course it's not going to feel good. So don't void the sadaqah. Yes, the sadaqah, even me working at home at home for my children, for my husband, is sadaqah. Absolutely it is. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, don't void the sadaqah, the investment that you give, by bragging or even by other, by harm, by telling people and trying to humiliate them that if it wasn't for you, their life would be nothing but miserable. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, don't do that. You're just voiding the sadaqah that you had invested. That's why Imam al-Qurtubi, he actually said, فَلَا تُزَكُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ, in that tafsir, in the ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, don't praise yourselves. Why? Because the second that you praise yourself, that's when you're taking yourself into arrogance. So al-Qurtubi says, لا تمدحوها ولا تثنوا عليها. Don't praise yourselves. And don't focus on the good things that you have done, because what's going to happen is that he said فإنه أبعد من الرياء وأقرب إلى الخشوع. Because if you don't praise yourself, that's what's going to keep you away from riya, from doing things just for the sake of praise. And that's what will get you closer to being humble and khushu', into being contained, and you want the reward from the Lord Almighty. That's why when we're talking about being humble, Imam ibn Kathir actually talks about the tafsir الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا. In Surah Al-Furqan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا وعباد الرحمن الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا وإذا خاطبهم الجاهلون قالوا سلاما. What happened? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes عباد الرحمن. عباد الرحمن, the servants of Ar-Rahman. الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا. When they walk with a gait that is hawna. What is hawna? They walk with a gait where it's not a pride, a gait of pride. It's not a gait of arrogance. It's actually a gait of humility. It's a gait here. Imam Ibn Kathir says بسكينة ووقار من غير جبرية ولا استكبار. He said it's basically a gate that has within it tranquility, without a gate of bullying, and without a gate in where it's authority, or even a gate of pride. Why? وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا. You will come across people that will probably abuse the humility that you're in. They will transgress the limits and think of you as being weak. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ. And when those people that are living in jahiliyyah, that are living self-centered, when they start talking to them, قَالُوا سَلَامًا. They just speak in peace. They just ignore them. They just contain themselves. Why? Because they know that the Lord Almighty is the Most High. They're not there to fight over self-centricity. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ادعو إلى سبيل ربك بالحكمة والموعظة الحسنة وجادلهم بالتي هي أحسن إن ربك هو أعلم بمن ضل عن سبيله وهو أعلم بالمهتدين. At the end of the day, your duty is to basically call for the path of the Lord Almighty with wisdom, with a kind word. But even if that kind word, sometimes it's not enough to be kind. Sometimes you gotta bring in the evidences. You gotta be strong in putting in and laying out those evidences. Billati hiya ahsan. What is billati hiya ahsan? Billati hiya ahsan, in where you're bringing in the evidence, you're learning, you're getting the education, laying out the evidences to the argument that you are trying to support. What? You're trying to support the argument, the ruling of the Lord Almighty, because at the end of the day, إِنَّ رَبَّكَ هُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِمَنْ ضَلَّ عَنْ سَبِيلِهِ, because the Lord Almighty, there's no way that you can recognize morality or the truth in different matters based on your perspective. You got to go back to who? You got to go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to identify what is the Islamic ruling in this and that regards. Because if you don't go back to the Islamic ruling, you're just projecting your own understanding, your own biases, your own observation in the matters, and thinking that you're ruling by the truth, when in reality there's no way that you can identify truth without wahi. You got to go back to the revelation. You got to go back to the books of fiqh. And if you don't know, well, use your time wisely to get some homework. وَهُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِالْمُهْتَدِينَ, because all your duty is supposed to be bringing in the guidance. And here, this is not only speaking about dealing with the non-Muslims, but this is also speaking about with Muslims, that, hey, this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rules. This is what haqq is. وَإِنْ عَاقَبْتُمْ, you will find an opposition to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here, although this ayah was revealed during the time of Uhud, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here, this is al-ibra bi'umum al-lafzi la bi-khusus al-sabab. The general statement is not necessarily in the context that it was revealed in, but the statement is going to be used in every single circumstance that simply falls within within a similar circumstance. وَإِنْ عَاقَبَتُمْ فَعَاقِبُوا بِمِثْلِ مَا عُقِبْتُمْ بِهِ. When people harm you, then you can harm back. In other words, retaliate in the same way. وَلَئِنْ صَبَرْتُمْ لَهُوَ خَيْرٌ لِلصَّابِرِينَ. If you are patient, if you are contain yourself and you don't retaliate, that's definitely better. But at the end of the day, don't let the moment in where you were abused take you out of recognizing that the Lord Almighty is not going to keep you in the state of trauma. وَاصْبِرْ وَمَا صَبْرُكَ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ. Give in that sabr, and remember that the only reason why you're making and practicing sabr is really for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَلَا تَحْزَنْ عَلَيْهِمْ. Don't feel the sorrow. And وَلَا تَكُ فِي ضَيْقٍ مِّمَّا يَمْكُرُونَ. At the end of the day, yes, it can still rub on your heart. It can still make you feel sad. It can still make you feel like that wasn't fair, and you recognize that that wasn't fair. The Lord Almighty tells you, He recognizes that they're plotting and plotting against you. إِنَّ اللَّهَ مَعَ الَّذِينَ اتَّقَوْا. So what should you do? The Lord Almighty tells you, Allah is with those that live the Lord Almighty's principle. وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ مُحْسِنُونَ. In other words, your duty is to still live the principle of the Lord Almighty and defend the principle. He didn't tell you to go back and fight. He was basically telling you, إِنَّ اللَّهَ مَعَ الَّذِينَ اتَّقَوْا. You continue defending the principle, because إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُدَافِعُ عَنِ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. Your Lord Almighty, in regards to yourself, He promised that He'll defend you. He promised you that He'll be there to bring about the defense for your own self. But your duty is to do what? Is to victory the name, and the Lord Almighty is to victory. The truth is to victory. His Sharia is to victory. His deen. Because the Lord Almighty tells you, once you're living that principle, the Lord Almighty is with you. As long as what? As long as you're living in taqwa, and as long as you're living in al-ihsan. So do I have to defend myself against oppression? Well, here's one thing. You have to. If you're being oppressed, I'm talking about whether it's your wealth, whether it's your health, whether it's your life, whether it's your reputation, definitely defend yourself. Don't just sit there. Al-Manawi says, Al-Manawi is an Egyptian scholar, right? And one thing to say about Al-Manawi is that he had actually he was inflicted with a very dangerous disease. I'm not really sure what it is, but he wasn't able to move his hands or his legs. Later, that happened and developed later in his life. So his own son was his it was his personal scriber to scribe all the different books that he wanted to write. So in other words, that this is amazing. And he said what أفاد أن ترك إزالة المنكر مع القدرة عظيم الإثم. He said what this hadith or the different hadith show is that to to leave removing the harm when you're capable of uplifting the harm is actually a sin. So if somebody is attacking you, you gotta do your best to stop it. Don't just sit there and cry. Do your best to defend yourself. But be careful. Be careful in living to their principle. If they're using the bad language, don't think that by using bad language that they're basically going to be you're basically going to be sorry, you're basically going to be winning because they're taking you to what they master best. They only master this type of language. Don't go that end. Don't go that end. There are certain ways in how you defend yourself against oppression. You live the principle of the Lord Almighty. Nusrat al-Mazloom in Nawawi says, defending those that are oppressed is actually fard kifaya. Is basically a common, what is it called? Fard, meaning it's an obligation on the community. And therefore, it is actually in general part of the different responsibilities in ordering for what is good and forbidding what is bad. And at the end of the day, whoever's capable of removing the harm, then you have to do that. Defending yourself from harm is obligatory. That's why the Prophet ﷺ actually said, "Unsur akhaka ظالما أو مظلوما." قالوا يا رسول الله هذا ننصره مظلوما فكيف ننصره ظالما؟ قال تأخذ فوق يده. The Prophet ﷺ, you could see this hadith is narrated in Bukhari, in where the Prophet ﷺ said, support your Muslim brother, whether they are oppressed or oppressors. Now, this was definitely a very common saying during the time of Jahiliyyah, during the pre-prophetic era. But they said, we would support them when they're oppressed, but how do we support them when they're oppressors? The Prophet ﷺ said, you basically stop them from oppressing others. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَمَنْ اعْتَدَى عَلَيْكُمْ فَاعْتَدُوا عَلَيْهِ بِمِثْلِ مَا اعْتَدَى عَلَيْكُمْ. Whoever oppresses you, whoever transgresses the limit, don't just stand there. Stand up and defend yourself. At the end of the day, can I actually talk about it? Can I seek others' help to stop the oppression that I'm in? Yes, let's look at this شعر. Well, it's a poem. All right. القدح ليس بغيبة في ستة متظلم ومعرف ومحذر ومجاهرا فسقا ومستفتا ومن طلب الإعانة في إزالة منكر. I want you to look at this one because many times, of course, when you're not capable of defending yourself, you may need to sometimes ask for a support or some kind of ailment, let's say it that way, in order to help you uplift this harm. And that's why here this poem, القدح ليس بغيبة في ستة. Can I actually speak of the harm that is happening to me? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا يحب الله الجهر بالسوء من القول إلا من ظلم. That the Lord Almighty dislikes that people would announce the harm in the words unless they were oppressed. And the Lord Almighty is all hearing, all seeing. Now that's the same thing in where this one. You can announce the harm that is happening onto you, and it would not be considered backbiting or it would not be considered gossiping in 6 different situations. One, if a person is going through some form of oppression, they wanted to probably speak about it and probably go to somebody that is capable of removing the oppression. Maybe a woman wants to tell her father, I'm going through this and this. Mu'arrifin, in where probably this person is known for that particular name. I don't want to use that particular name. Maybe they're called Aysha. Maybe uh, they're called the Somali or the African or the white person or what. They're used a different name. In other words, we're using it as a description. This is not whatsoever considered as qadh. Okay, this is mu'arrif. If this is what the person is known for, or even if a particular appearance on them, I didn't mean to be condescending, I didn't mean to be offensive, I just wanted to be descriptive, then in that situation it would not be haram. It depends on the intention. Two, or three, muhadhir. You knew that that person was a drug addict, and you knew that they were around your friend's son, and you wanted to warn them. This person is a drug addict. Be careful. He will actually try to manipulate and appeal to your son to use drugs or whatever it is. Now you're here making sure you're trying to warn someone. Mujahiran fisqan. Mujahiran fisqan, a person that is openly announcing their sins. And in that situation, this wouldn't be a ghaiba because they're announcing their sins. They're publicly speaking about and boasting about how they probably do haram things. This is not a ghaiba. If I were to say, well, this person, mujahiran fisqan, or even probably a leader that's killing millions of people, it's not actually a ghaiba by speaking about what they had committed and the atrocities that they had committed in Yemen or probably Syria, whatever it is. Mustaftin, a person that's asking for a fatwa. This person's calling you up and calling up and saying, hey, I'm going through this and this situation. Although, yes, definitely I would recommend trying to seek a way to stay confidential, to stay, to stay anonymous, but you could still ask if it's seeking a fatwa. ومن طلب الإعانة في إزالة منكر. If the person is seeking and support in order to uplift the harm that is happening to them, then in that situation, defending yourself or seeking support to defend yourself for these different situations is not considered a ghaiba. It's not considered that you're actually committing ghaiba or even backbiting. If you're facing oppression, you have no way of defending yourself. The Prophet ﷺ had taught us and instructed us, ثلاث دعوات مستجابات لا شك فيهن. There are three du'as, there are three invocations. They will be answered with no doubt. Number one, دعوة المظلوم. The dua, the invocation that an oppressed one does. Two, the dua of a person on a journey. Three, the dua of the parent on their own child. These are not rejected. So be careful. And at the end of the day, is that recognize that if you are oppressed, don't think that this is the end. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never whatsoever let il-batil or let injustice prevail. The Lord Almighty will give you the power. But here's one thing. I want you to look at this. There are three things in the Quran that were described as jamil, as beautiful. Number one, الصبر الجميل, الهجر الجميل, and الصفح الجميل. Let's look at that. Sabr jamil, beautiful patience. Safh al-jamil, giving in and forgiving in a beautiful way. And al-hajr al-jamil. And al-hajr al-jamil is when you basically keep distance in a beautiful way. Now, one thing is that when you look at these, Ibn Taymiyyah in his book Al-Ubudiyya, man, if you would only quote this quote, beautiful, just this quote. And he said, what does it mean to have a sabr al-jamil? Beautiful patience actually means a patience where you don't you're not constantly complaining. If you're really practicing sabr, don't complain. Because the second that you start complaining or you start using bad language and you start hitting the things around you, sorry, but you were not patient. You were losing your patience. You were getting it out on other things. الصفح الجميل. الصفح الجميل when you're giving in, when you're forgiving people in a beautiful way. What is الصفح الجميل? It would be contradicting to that if you're constantly bragging, if you're constantly just reminding them of the pain that they had probably caused you once. You're constantly, every time you would say, remember when you did this to me, remember when you did that to me, that contradicts a safh al jamil. If you had decided that you wanted to give up, don't constantly bring it back. And ladies, please just keep that in mind. The family, whether it's a husband or a wife, three things will destruct your marriage. Constantly bringing up and bringing old disagreements. If you're constantly just bringing it every time we would go into a disagreement, yeah, but you did this, and it becomes this problem. Many years back, when we were first married, you did this, you forgot to do this, you said this, and so forth. This will always make your marriage in hell. Number two, when we're speaking about sabr al jamil, if you're constantly just bragging of how well you cleaned the house and how he's not helping and how this is a suicide to your marriage. If you want to live a sabr al jamil, really live a sabr al jamil. Don't brag. If you really want to live a safh al jamil, don't constantly bring in all the different harm that that person had done to you, because that means you didn't do safh jamil. You didn't do that forgiving. That means you're still living there. You're still living in that black spot in history, and you didn't move on. And guess what? That black spot in history, if you're still living in it, it's gonna make your life black all your life. It's never gonna turn white if you stay in that black hole. الهجر الجميل. If you wanted to sometimes take some time off away from the person that probably harmed you, do al-hajr al-jamil. Don't harm. You live the principle even when others are not. Even when others are not, don't let others drag you. When they're living the wrong akhlaq, don't get dragged in their wrong akhlaq. Do al-hajr al-jamil. Don't harm. Just take a distance. Keep away until they heal. Sometimes when you get too close, they don't recognize your value. You value yourself by sometimes taking a distance. And that's why hajurhum hajran jamila. Sometimes you have to do that. So what should we do in those situations? Remember, Inna Allah ya'muru bil adli wal ihsan. Your Lord Almighty orders for justice and ihsan. If justice is not within your scope, justice is, I give you this much, you give me this much, then go up to a different level. Do what is right, even if the others are not giving you the justice. And guess what? The ones to harm you the most are going to be your relatives, are going to be your siblings, are going to be the people that are the closest to you. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, Ita'i dhul qurba. Give to al-qurba. Don't always expect anything in return. Why? Because you want to do it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They will transgress, they will abuse your kindness. Yes, they will. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, well, even when they abuse your kindness, يَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنْكَرِ وَالْبَغْيِ. Your Lord Almighty forbids you from oral aggression, any type of transgression, or even oppression. Aggression, transgression, and oppression. In other words, keep your akhlaq in place. So what should you do to keep your akhlaq in place? Learn your deen. So that's why وَمَا تَوَاضَعَ أَحَدٌ لِلَّهِ إِلَّا رَفَعَهُ. Whenever you're humble just for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He'll be the one to elevate you. Don't wait for people to elevate you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that elevates you. And that's why when you look at that hadith, وَلَا فَتَحَ عَبْدٌ بَابَ مَسْأَلَةٍ إِلَّا فَتَحَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ بَابَ فَقْرٍ. Any person that opens up the door to seek and ask from people, the Lord Almighty will open a door for him. In other words, another type of deprivation, another type of need. Don't put yourself in a position where you're in need of people. Learn how to be independent yourself. Learn how to fix your matters yourself. Don't go and asking people for support. Don't go and asking people not for food, not for anything. Learn how to be independent. So what if I'm in need? The Prophet ﷺ, look at this hadith. The Prophet ﷺ actually said right here, Qabisa ibn Mukhariq, he said تحملت حمالة فأتيت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. He said, what is تحملت حمالة? It's basically he got into a problem. He wanted to reconciliate between two people, but then in order to reconciliate between them, he basically used his money because these two parties did not want to compromise for one another. So he decided to compromise and give from his own wealth to compromise between the two. And so he did. So he went to the Prophet ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ, he went to ask for the Prophet ﷺ. He's like, this is what I did, and now I'm in deficit. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, just wait until we would get money coming in, and we'll give you some to compensate you for what you had given. So he said, the Prophet ﷺ tells him, Ya Qabisa, إن المسألة لا تحل إلا لأحد ثلاثة. Giving, in other words, it's not permissible for anyone to ask for money except in three different circumstances. Number one, رجل تحمل حمالة فحلت له المسألة. A person that wanted to compromise between two, but he actually couldn't make any of them compromise, so he decided to pay from his own money to reconciliate between two people in dispute. That's number one. Then another person, رجل أصابته جائحة اجتاحت ماله فحلت له المسألة. A man that goes into some form of calamity, some form of a major calamity that basically had eaten up, taken away all his wealth, and in that situation, he can ask for financial support in order to give him, some form of financial assistance, to give him sidadan min aish. In other words, to give him, just to basically help him stand up and move on in his life. وَرَجُلٌ أَصَابَتْهُ فَاقَةٌ حَتَّى يَقُومَ ثَلَاثَةٌ مِنْ ذَوِي الْحِجَى مِنْ قَوْمِهِ لَقَدْ أَصَابَتْ فُلَانًا فَاقَةٌ. And this point is extremely important, especially for those that work in nonprofit organizations in giving financial assistance to people. Let's listen to this one, in where he said, in a man that had come, saying that he had come through across a calamity in his life, in where he needs three people, and look at this word, min dhawil hijab. He needs three witnesses that understand, in other words, they have experience to recognize whether this person is really in need, whether this person is capable of putting effort, or whether this person is claiming to be in need. It's just that he's just being too lazy to work, or whatever it is. In that situation, we need three different people that have the experience, the knowledge to understand the circumstance. In other words, they have the wisdom to recognize that this person really is in need, and not necessarily claiming to be in need. And therefore, in that situation, it is permissible for them to go and seek financial assistance. In other words, not because anybody is asking for financial assistance, you would just go give them. You need to make sure that these people are really in need in order for you to give them. You don't let your money loose like that. So, this is right there, just part of it. And in that situation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right there praised those that still would find ways and seek ways to be independent and not ask for other people's support because they want to be the ones to support themselves. وصلوا على سيدنا محمد and barakallahu fikum. This is just one, this is just one side of these two ahadith, but there's so much more to say. But just because of timing and barakallahu fikum, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. I guess no questions. That's all right. So inshallah, we'll see you all next week. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.